There just aren't the drugs.
There aren't the drugs because the regulation in the system doesn't pull them through, because there is no clear commercialization pathway. That's why we kind of went with this one idea, one token versus one scientist, one token.
Very interesting. I'm not sure you're right.
Guys, I'm imagining an Aubrey coin and a Brian coin just going up and down. That would be insane.
Yeah.
Today, I'm joined by two people coming at the future of longevity from very different angles. Dr. Aubrey de Grey is one of the most recognizable figures in this field, best known for pioneering the idea of longevity escape velocity and leading research on damage repair and aging. And Benji Leibowitz is the founder of Pump Science, building decentralized, permissionless systems to accelerate biotech and longevity science, what he calls scientific escape velocity. Together, they bring different and unique perspectives to the longevity field. This is the Acc Podcast. Please enjoy.
Welcome to the podcast. It's super great to have you both. Two very different but very similar areas of science, if I will say. But Aubrey, I want to start with you first. Something that's very famous in the longevity community is this concept of longevity escape velocity, right? And that is the point where we're repairing biological damage faster than it actually accumulates. And so I kind of want to start this conversation out with a sort of a technical thought process of like, how close do you think we are to actually reaching that point? And how do you think we measure that progress to that point?
Right. So, of course, as with any pioneering technology, we can only give a probabilistic estimate of how long it's going to take to get there. But my current estimate is that we have a 50% chance of getting there within the next 12 to 15 years. So by the end of the 2030s. Measuring progress, that's a very good question. There are two kinds of progress, really. One is how well are we doing in terms of postponing the aging of laboratory organisms, especially mice. And the other is how well are the various components of this damage repair portfolio working individually on people who are suffering from that particular type of damage more rapidly than they're suffering from other types of damage. So that's how these things are normally tested. The whole idea of damage repair is very much a divide and conquer, multi-pronged concept. You have to get a lot of things working and being applied to the same people at the same time in order to get a proper postponement of the health problems of late life. But you can still test them individually in individual people who are suffering from this or that thing. So, for example, there are already clinical trials going on to test the effectiveness of stem cell treatments for Parkinson's disease. And that works because Parkinson's disease is driven by a particular type of damage, the loss of a particular type of neuron. And it turns out that because those neurons are localized in a very small, specific place in the brain, you can just inject stem cells and have some chance of success. This actually, when it was first tried 30 or more years ago, it did work occasionally, but only occasionally, because back then we didn't really have any idea how to manipulate stem cells in the laboratory before we injected them. Now, of course, we know masses about that. So people are very hopeful now that the clinical trials that are ongoing, and there are half a dozen of them, will be successful. So, and we can do the same kind of thing for pretty much every type of damage that accumulates in our bodies. There's always going to be this or that, disease that is resulting either from just natural variation or from congenital problems, so that the onset of the disease may, in such cases, be very early in childhood even, but we can still test the efficacy of the interventions.
Very cool. That is like a very sort of technical problem, and you've detailed all these different things that are being done in the field to try and achieve that, whether it's through stem cell therapy, small molecules are being tested. Obviously, gene therapies are now sort of gaining a lot of traction in the aging space. I know there's companies out there that are trying to develop multiplexed sort of gene therapies. One of them is actually a spin out from the Church Lab, which is where I used to work. But yeah, so that is like a very technical problem, right? And so Benji, I kind of want to talk to you about this other concept called scientific escape velocity. And this is not a technical problem in longevity, right? But it's this idea that research accelerates not through traditional institutions, but through public, permissionless, decentralized science. So can you kind of talk to me about what is that concept to you? And what does that mean in the context of what Pump Science is sort of building? And I'm going to try and connect these two thoughts here shortly.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the frame of reference here is LLMs, honestly. So if you think about why AI has made so much progress in the, with the media of text and video, because there's so much text and video that's online to train on, right? You have so much data to work with. And when you have ample data, then the limiting resource becomes compute. And so, a lot of these big companies have ample resources to throw at compute. And so now you just train on all this, basically open text data that's online and video data that's online. This kind of abundance of training data does not yet really exist in not only like science broadly, but aging specifically. Many of the data sets that are required are kind of hidden behind paywalls or hidden within the firewalls of private companies. And so many of these companies will go and try and develop super valuable data sets. But the way that the biotech and financial system and IP systems are set up, all of that data is kind of constrained as a private asset within each of these different entities. And so that data basically only lives and can be used and potentially dies with the startups that generate it. And there just really isn't, kind of like an abundance of public data for AI to train on and people to train models on. And so the requirements to, basically throw a ton of money at the problem is required. And it just doesn't seem to be kind of like moving the needle as much as we would all like it to be. There's kind of this other, just one more thing I'd like to add quickly, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts, Aubrey. And the other is the scientific publishing side of things. And so if you are even in academia, many times you're not rate limited by the physical time it takes to run the experiments and generate the data and process it, but rather the times of reviewers and publishing and the whole publishing cycle. And so there's, of course, like the funding rate limiter with grants. There is the execution of the experiments rate limiter, which actually doesn't really seem to be the bottleneck. And then there's the publishing side. And so, which is incredibly slow, right? And so I think when we think about, scientific escape velocity, it is the funding being able to be raised as fast as it is needed to answer the right question, to run the right experiment, and then being able to be published as soon as it is generated. And so basically making sure that the funding and the publishing side of things are not rate limiters, but everything kind of bottoms out at the time it takes for the physics to run in the actual lab. So when I think about like scientific escape velocity, it's that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was a very good summary, Benji. I got a couple of things to say to echo kind of and amplify some of the things you said. Starting at the end, the whole business of publishing, of course, this has improved. The acceptability of putting something out on the archive or bioarchive is now, a lot better than it was. Biology was a long way behind, maths and physics in that regard. But so one can get one's work out there now in a manner that does not, impair one's ability to have it come out in the top journals in the long run. And that's definitely an improvement. But yeah, I mean, the difficulty, of course, is that people's career structures are still defined in academia very much on the basis of the impact factor of which journals they publish in, which is completely crazy. I mean, the H index is a so much better way of doing things, and it's existed for like 20 years, and it still is much less used when in things like promotions and tenure and so on than impact factors are, which is crazy. But the result is that even though you can get the word out of what experiments you've done, you've still got to wait for the publications. And as you say, it's not just the fact that publication takes a long time. In fact, in the top journals, it doesn't take so long. The main problem is fashion. The fact that you can only publish what the journals want to publish. And so in terms of the topics that you publish on, it's got to be things that people already think are interesting and fashionable. But worse than that, it's virtually impossible to publish negative results, because the journals are just not interested. And, obviously there have been efforts for decades to try to change that, and they've been completely unsuccessful. I honestly don't know what can be done about that, but a huge part of the problem, the rate limiter of science, is not knowing what other people have tried and failed to make work. It's completely crazy. There's other things like this that are true not only at the level of, both at the level of academia and at the level of the private sector. You're obviously quite right that the large data sets that are so necessary for the kind of work that you were talking about are mostly not available. And a lot of people will try to use reasons like confidentiality as reasons for that, which is kind of being addressed now with ways of scrambling data in a way that anonymizes it adequately, but it's still got a long way to go. However, the IP aspect is critical, of course, and so many academics are now going into the private sector, starting companies and trying to get things done that way, so that they can sidestep the glacial nature of grant applications. And it's only working when people can make money. And there are some things that need to be done that just, you can't make money out of. So actually, I'm working with that company that you mentioned, Shriya, Rejuvenate Bio. Noah Davidson and I are talking quite a bit about using their OSK vector for our next experiment. But our experiments are all about, because we're looking to eventually have this panel of interventions for people, we're all about combining things that other people have developed. And therefore, they own the IP. Or in many cases, the IP doesn't exist anyway. These things are unpatentable. So we have no choice but to fund our work through philanthropy. And because, you won't get a grant application for things like this either, because it's not the kind of thing that tests hypotheses and, gets into top journals. So yeah, it definitely slows us down getting the money in the door to start these experiments.
Yeah, Benji, you mentioned earlier, the limit of data that we have for longevity drugs, or like the frontier models in protein ML or like protein design heavily rely on existing crystallography data of like protein structure and these like functional outputs, these assays to like generate novel molecules. Do you kind of envision like pump science, what you guys are doing right now, where you're basically trying to test as many compounds as possible? Do you view that data that's produced by those experiments as potentially like training data almost? And Aubrey, do you have any thoughts on sort of the mission and like and what pump science is kind of doing with that? Yeah, I'll start with Benji.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Aubrey, go ahead if you'd like.
No, I honestly don't feel particularly knowledgeable on this, so I'm going to leave it to you.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. So 100% to both of your questions. So we both want to reduce the funding bottleneck and create trainee data in an open way, right? Such that anyone can train on the actual functional data of lifespan extension experiments on various different model organisms and hopefully humans as well in a completely open and permissionless way. I really, Aubrey's longevity escape velocity thesis has, kind of captured my, attention, and like, I started to think about it as a physics problem and like a math problem, and just look at it, as, what are the rate limiting steps? Where are the friction? And how can those points of friction be removed? And really, I think what it comes down to us is the funding component, glacial, as Aubrey explained it, and this kind of like public trainee data set that people can train on. So I think you're talking about like the Arc Institute models, EVO, which are super interesting. And, you can go train on genetic data, which is public, and there's tons of it. But how do you translate all of that, kind of, phenotypic data and genomic data into something phenotypic where, you have associations between the language and the outcome. And, they published, oh, hey, we can basically deduce the pathogenicity of BRCA mutations from this genetic model. And it's like, cool, we've been able to do that with phenotypic data that's in all of these oncology diagnostics companies for years. Like, my first job was at Tempest Labs, which is an oncology genomics company. And we know which mutations are pathogenic versus variants of unknown significance. We don't need an LLM for that. I think where AI becomes super important is for much more interesting problems. But to do that, you need data that isn't in the public domain right now. And so, like I have yet to see like the real utility come from Evo unless it's happening behind closed doors and we just don't know about it. But the real data sets that are super valuable, the phenotypic ones, which drugs increase lifespan, that data doesn't really exist. There's like 2,000 data points basically on various compounds and life extension experiments on animals. The ITP, the Interventions Testing Program, has run, I don't know, it's like 50 or maybe less, 30, something like that. Nothing impressive. And then Drug Age, which is a giant database by, a bunch of the longevity researchers, has produced about 2,000 compounds and their lifespan extension effects on various model organisms. And so this isn't enough for AI to train on. Like you need thousands and thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. And all of that comes down to, financing being the rate limiter. And so our whole thinking is, well, there's so much energy in this whole crypto world. How do we kind of align that energy and desire to fund interesting work into longevity, right? And so rather than, kind of take the DAO approach, which has been tried for years now by, Vita DAO and many others in the space, we are going after, more of something that looks like meme coins, which is meme coin tokenomics. That's much, much more speculative, frankly. And, kind of tying the value of the compound to the token directly. So basically one token, one compound, let people figure out what they think are interesting compounds to test. We'll make as many AI tools available to them so that they can make, good scientifically backed decisions and create this data set that AI needs to help to help come up with ideas of how to help us live longer and achieve this longevity, escape velocity. Apologies for rambling.
That's really interesting. I was not really all that aware that you were going this one token, one compound route. That's pretty interesting. How about one token, one researcher? That would work.
Yeah, so we thought about tokenizing the researcher. It is certainly of interest. The problem is, and what we perceive to be the problem is, many scientists are worried about launching a token that represents them because they feel that their identity and their own brand value is then now tied to that token. So when the token inevitably goes up and down, their own personal brand will be proportional. And so they worry about that. And it becomes a huge inhibitor to them, participating in the system. When you separate the idea from the scientist, they become much more interested because, you can throw out many ideas and hope that one of them hits, very much like the biotech world and science. Like you need to, throw a lot of irons in the fire and one of them will hit. And so that's why we kind of went with this one idea, one token versus one scientist, one token.
Very interesting. I'm not sure you're right. I think that very much the same way that I was saying earlier, it has been increasingly popular for academics to go out and start companies. It's kind of the same deal. Companies have valuations, which go up and down. And,
But Rejuvenate Bio is not George Church's only company. He pulls up his Cognition slide and it's a collage.
Well, sure. And so there are obviously some people in the field who have multiple irons in multiple fires. David Sinclair's another one, of course. But, Rejuvenate Bio is Noah Davidson's only company. It's like, I don't think it's as much of a problem as you're saying, to be honest. I think that, scientists are always competing against each other in one way or another. And they prefer to compete in a manner that's got more clarity, I think, more transparency. I think, if your ideas are working or if your ideas are gaining credibility among people who actually are funding the research, that's something that you're going to be happy about. And if they're not, then that's an incentive to move in other directions. But it's kind of the same incentive, it seems to me, as the incentive to move into the private sector. So a little bit more more optimistic about that approach than you're saying.
Amazing. And if you would like to experiment with such a vehicle, we would absolutely love to experiment with you. I think for someone like yourself, who is extremely well known in the field and who already has a large community that's following you, I think it may work extremely well. I think for no-name scientists or less well-known scientists across the world, I think they may struggle to raise the necessary funding relative to you.
And that's another thing that I think we ought to talk about, actually, because you're totally right. 98% of scientists are what you're calling no-name scientists. Hardly anybody knows them because they never talk. They never talk to the wider world. In longevity, there's literally a dozen of us at most who actually, do a general audience talk or podcast or anything more than, like, say, once a month. It's a tiny number, and we are the people who have the responsibility to drive the field forward because we're the ones who get listened to, who have an audience, including people obviously who are in a position to write checks.
Absolutely. And it's honestly been super interesting for me to kind of delve into this field and just realize how small it is. It's like, okay, there's only like a handful of people. I think what we want to make sure is that the funding is going to the right ideas, right? And the 10 to 12 prominent longevity scientists, of course, deserve, the lion's share of the funding, but so do these kind of no-name scientists who, enable them to take risks. I think one other point I want to mention, and just bringing back what you said earlier, which is like everything is probabilistic, right? And I think even for an individual researcher, if we were to tokenize them, they wouldn't want to submit one idea, right? They would want to submit many that, based on their perceived probabilities of success among each idea. I think when you kind of tokenize the idea, it allows you to kind of hedge your bets across these various probabilities so that the probabilities of success converge at one, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Guys, I'm imagining an Aubrey coin and a Brian coin just going up and down. That would be insane.
Yeah, there's a book.
Yeah.
There's a great book that I highly, highly recommend. And it's called The Unincorporated Man. And it's basically set in the future about 200 years ago, or 200 years into the future. There's a man who is a billionaire in our era, and he frees himself, and he wakes up. And in the future, every single person is incorporated. They each have their own stock. They're basically tokenized. And their income is basically like you're your own corporation, so to speak, and your own personal cash flows go to the equity token, whatever you want to call it. And so that's much more aligned with, I think, what Aubrey is talking about, where you have, basically each person is tokenized. And you're already starting to see this with some artists, like musicians. You're already starting to see this with some athletes who have high, very predictable cash flows, right? But for a scientist, that's not necessarily the case quite yet. But for biotech assets, it actually is. So when you do a valuation model in biotech, you value each individual asset individually. You do what's called a sum of the parts. You model out the patient population, the probability of passing clinical trials, the number of doses, the price, all of these things on an individual asset level. And that's how you get to the valuation of the company. So it really seems like in biotech, because the assets are all so high risk, but once they're de-risked, their cash flows are very predictable. That actually makes sense to tokenize the asset. So anyway, it's kind of like a financial, technical reason for this too, that I think backs this tokenized idea kind of approach. But anyway, we are not beholden to any specific ideas. We don't have time to be. So we're absolutely happy to experiment with any and all forms of tokenization.
Yeah, I guess how would you prevent a tokenized researcher market from turning into
popularity
a
contest?
popularity
It will
contest
be, without a shred of a doubt. You can't.
Yeah.
Well, you kind of can. I mean, coming back to the analogy I was giving with researchers going out and starting companies, companies don't exactly compete with each other in that popularity contest way. What they do is they compete for investors, and they are trying to convince different people that their technology is likely to be profitable in the long run. So this is a kind of generalization of that. It seems to me it's like it's a popularity contest in a superficial way.
And in the short term.
But
In the short term, yeah.
yeah, in reality, it's just like, how convincing are your ideas?
Yes. And I think that then becomes the question of like, how do you value those ideas, right? And so
Right,
then
and of
you
course,
come
that
back
value,
to a market for valuing ideas anyway, you know?
and of course, there's monetary value and there's philanthropic value. People who want to give money away for good causes have to be convinced that their money is going to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Aubrey, is there like a... Oh,
No,
sorry,
please,
Benji,
please,
if you had a
please, all
thought.
good.
Is there like a good correlation between the popularization of a certain compound or of a certain treatment in aging and the like actual scientific legitimacy of that treatment? Or do you sometimes notice this like misalignment?
There's hardly any alignment. Yeah, I mean, of course, things get popular before they've been tested. That's it's kind of by definition that things can only you can only get a large amount of data on whether something works when a lot of people are trying it, and that won't happen until either it goes through a large phase 3 clinical trial, or it gets popular on in some off-label way. Of course, we can also talk about things that are simply not patented anyway. But yeah, so I mean, when it comes to things that are already available, that's kind of a different question from the one we've been addressing in the past few minutes, where we're talking about, well, I'm really only talking about research, about things that we know that we that we don't know whether such a thing works, but we know that it's worth finding out because it might well work. There's a reason to believe that it has a good chance of working, and that may cost money. So, the question is, can one be convincing that the chances of this or that thing working, or this or that combination of things, actually is a respectably high chance, and therefore a chance worth throwing money at?
And Benji, so you guys are testing the molecules on mostly C. elegans, right? Or
we have a funnel. We
for
have a
now?
funnel, right? And so the top of the
Okay,
funnel is C. elegans, and then flies,
gotcha.
and then mice, and then humans. And so, basically, like the way we think about this calculation of reducing friction to achieve longevity state velocity is, how do we get the most signal to AI per unit cost and time? So that's the framing.
So,
And so, like, if you think about it, C. elegans, we like to think of as basically 35% signal, because that's the proteomic similarity between humans and C. elegans. Flies are 60% signal because of the proteomic similarity with humans. Mice, I think, are 80% in terms of proteomic similarity. And so, and then you have to come up with cost and time. And costs are simple, like no need to explain there. But time is obviously like the lifespan of each of those model organisms. And so the reason we start with worms is
yeah.
because it's the highest signal per cost time. And then, yeah, basically, like, as the compounds are kind of validated in, this first layer screen, we move them to the subsequent screen. So we like to think of this as kind of like the de-risking pipeline for longevity interventions.
Sure.
Yeah, so I
I
have
guess,
some point
yeah, go
here
for it, Aubrey.
that I probably don't say enough. I really think we should stop using C. elegans for longevity experiments. I think that the problem is not that they're just, a long, long way away from us in the tree of life. The problem is that it's just too easy to extend their lifespan. There are hundreds and hundreds of things you can do. Basically, shut down any aspect of metabolism in worms, and they live longer. It's like, so I believe that you can get misled really easily by C. elegans lifespan experiments. I don't think the same applies nearly so much to flies. So when you gave those numbers just now, the proteomic similarities, I believe you, but the point is, I think the actual correlation of efficacy in terms of life extension is going to be a lot bigger than the difference you just described between C. elegans and flies. And therefore, if I were you, if I were advising you or running your experiment, I would just skip the worms and start with flies. Now I know they live twice as long, so yeah, that's an issue, but maybe 3 times as long, yeah, depending on how well you can do it. but I think it's probably worth it. I think if you end up, you know, getting a really bad signal to noise ratio from the worms and doing the wrong experiments in flies, then that will be a net loss relative to just skipping the worms in the first place.
It's super valid. I would honestly, so because the cost is so low to run the worm experiments, and both in dollars and time, I think it's worth generating this data set to find out. Just to answer that question with raw data, because I tend to agree with you, but I would love to be convinced with explicit evidence that I frankly have not seen. I think one other thing that you mentioned, just in terms of like the predictive power of the C. elegans data, is like everything increases lifespan of C. elegans, right? And so, much of this comes down to the point you made about impact factor, needing to publish, et cetera. Like, many of these scientists just want to make whatever they're finding seem more significant. And so what we've done already is look at the correlation between the life extension we're seeing as like kind of like an objective neutral third party, lab, so to speak, versus what we're seeing in Drug Age, which is a bunch of publications, right, by, grad students.
Right.
And we're seeing crazy inflation on their part versus what we're seeing. We're seeing, modest, much more modest life extension relative to what has been published. And so I wonder if this may be the reason why there is extremely poor predictive power between worms and flies, is because of the need to publish, lack of blinding that you see in academia. So it may actually be much stronger than we think, but we really need apples to apples comparisons, testing all these compounds at the same lab with the same scientists, ideally in an automated way, to kind of make much better associations between these different model organisms. You could totally be right. My hypothesis is you are 100% right, but if you are wrong, there will be a lot of cost and time savings if we can test on the C. elegans, and so I think it's worth trying.
We see drugs failing from phase 2 to 3, and that is after millions and millions of dollars of investment. And even at the mouse stage, like if it works, Aubrey, maybe you have more perspective on this. My perception is like no one gets super excited. At least like most of the conservative scientists are like, yeah, this is cool. Let's find out what happens next. Do you think that's different in the longevity space? Do you think that perception of mouse data is more optimistic, less optimistic in the longevity space compared to like traditional biopharma?
I don't think I can give a simple answer to that, so I'm going to give a complicated one. Essentially, there is just as much pessimism about translatability from mice to humans in longevity as there is in the rest of the field. But that pessimism mostly arises from what we see with small molecules. So, of course, all manner of small molecules are tested in mice, and some of them, do actually work in terms of extending lifespan. But a couple of things. First of all, it's very well understood that calorie restriction, and therefore also all calorie restriction mimetics, work far less well in long-lived species than they do in short-lived species. And this is, easily explainable from straightforward evolutionary theory. So you really don't want to be focusing on things that are essentially calorie restriction mimetics. Apart from anything else, they work less well when you start late in life, right? Because they're slowing down the accumulation of damage rather than repairing damage. And then on top of that, when you combine small molecules, which Brian Kennedy especially has been doing a lot of lately, then you get, completely unpredictable results. Things cancel out or fail to synergize when you expect them to all the time. Now, I'm reasonably optimistic that the situation will be better with damage repair. When you are doing essentially preventative stuff, trying to get rid of this or that type of damage, whether it's senescent cells or, waste products or whatever, before they have reached a level that's pathogenic, then, you're kind of not interfering with metabolism in quite as egregious a way as you are when you're throwing a small molecule into the bloodstream. So there's a better chance, I think, of being able to predict what things are going to be additive. However, that's a hunch. I'm not saying I really, have confidence in that hunch. Then in terms of the value of translatability, it's also important to recognize that in longevity, it's not just about whether the actual approach will translate. It's whether success in mice can alter the conversation, the attitude to the whole thing. So my focus at LEV Foundation is squarely on getting as much life extension in mice as I possibly can, starting in middle age, by throwing the kitchen sink at these mice. And the idea is that if we succeed in getting a lot more than anyone's ever got before, then even if we don't necessarily believe that those same interventions will translate to humans, nevertheless, we have completely changed the conversation. We have, given a much better demonstration that aging really is malleable. And of course, we'd like to do that in a longer-lived species, a species that's more closely related to humans. But at the end of the day, if you're only relying on health data, then people are always going to be skeptical that you are, that your definition of health is, cherry-picked in some way. You have to do lifespan, and therefore you have to use short-lived species. But it very much helps if you're using species that have legs and fur and stuff, because then people actually relate a little bit better. And that's also why it's important to start late in life. So we start our experiments we use black 6 mice, so they live about 2.5 years on average. We start at 1.5 years, and when you do that with calorie restriction or with rapamycin, you get about 4 months of life extension. I always like to say in terms of months rather than percentages, because if you say percentages, then you constantly have to go back and make sure that people understand whether you're talking about total lifespan or remaining lifespan, and that's boring. So 4 months. So I want 12 months. I want to get these mice to live to an average of 3.5 years rather than only 2.5. That's trebling the effect size that we can currently do. And I think that if I had $20 million, I would have an 80% chance of getting there within 3 or 4 years. I would basically do 3 more of the experiments that we want to do, these multi-pronged damage repair things. The experiment that we just concluded a few months ago had 4 interventions, really only 3 because one of them was rapamycin. The next one's going to have 8 interventions, but it's going to cost, $6 million. And I'm still raising that.
Yeah, because it's also lifespan versus health span, right? You need to sort of decide which one, like you can't, so for lifespan, you have to, take them to death. And so that means that you can't, correct me if I'm wrong, you can't harvest the mice and check out their,
that's not
metabolics.
No, that's not true at all. So first of all, there are loads and loads of non-invasive measures of health span. You can measure, curvature of the spine, or, loss of fur, or body weight, of course. You can measure memory. You can measure, blindness and deafness, and
Sure.
And endurance and grip strength and so on. These are all very established methods. But also, of course, you can kill some of the mice whenever you like. And we did in our experiment.
That's expensive, though, right? Each mice is roughly $200. And so every mice you kill kind of affects the end size of the health data that you want to collect.
That is very true. It is expensive. But then some of the non-invasive measures are also not
Sure.
cheap. So, so you're quite right. There are lots of expenses. And in fact, in our first experiment, the tissues that we stored from the mice that we culled, and also from some of the mice that died naturally, those tissues are still sitting in formalin, or in some cases we froze them. So it's we haven't even done that part of the stuff yet. So there's still more money to be raised for that. But yeah, as I say, the point is that we want to know that health is being increased. But honestly, the value of that knowledge is a bit rhetorical. Because if you're measuring lifespan, damn well you're not going to be increasing lifespan by a lot unless you're increasing health span by a lot as well. You cannot increase sick span by a factor of 3. You just can't. So it's kind of superfluous. But of course, at the same time, you've got to do it because people are terribly fixated on health span. Nobody wants to stay sick.
And what would you say are the best near-term predictives, I guess you could say leading indicators of death in mice? Health span, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. So I wish we knew. I mean, the reason we did the entire gamut in our experiment was because there is no real consensus on that. All of these things that I just spoke about, and also metabolic things. We took blood draws as well. We measured glucose tolerance. All of these things they change with age, and of course it's different from different strains. That's why the ITP went for this four-way cross called Het3. It's like I wouldn't want to say that there's any single measure. And of course, we haven't actually done much of the statistics on this yet, but we will be just releasing our analysis of which things worked better in which treatment groups in terms of which types of health measure. But no, I wouldn't want to pick out one or even two health measures as the best.
Fair enough. What I'm really excited about, one of the labs that we're working with for the mice can do automated tracking of the mice from above with a camera. And so it is my...
We're going to use that.
Maybe we're working with the same lab.
Olden Labs?
Well, they use Olden Labs cages. The lab we're working with.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah. So
we're collaborating directly with Aubrey de Grey.
Oh, amazing. Amazing. Yeah, no, I think we found the cost can come down a few over feet, but they're using Olden Labs cages 100%. Incredible technology. The way I think about this is very much as like an energetics problem. So I think when we talk about health span, whatever, it's really about like how much energy can you output on a daily basis, right? That's really the measure of health. I mean, you can break it down as all these biomarkers, but if you think about it as like a Kardashev problem, which is health, progress, all of these things can be measured by how much energy can you metabolize and process, expend. Really.
Yeah, so I would like to put a bit of a variation on that. I don't think it's actually about how much energy you can output. I think it's how much energy the body chooses to output. I think that a lot of the energy output that we see is to some extent an adaptation that where the body is essentially looking after itself better and not like putting the pedal to the metal simply because it's kind of sensing that there's shit going wrong.
I think you're talking about baseline metabolism. Yeah. What I'm talking about is like functional testing.
I mean, it goes both ways. You can't
treadmill, hanging type.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. But the point is, it's a use it or lose it thing. If the body is adapting by running its mitochondria at a lower level, so shall we say, then what that's going to translate into is having fewer mitochondria or having less muscle mass or whatever. And so as time goes on, the peak energy output is also going to decline.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah. Anyway, I'm just very excited by these kind of health span metrics and which ones actually predict death, so that you don't have to run the 3.5-year experiment to get that understanding of the effect size, because we do need to iterate faster. 3.5 years is not sufficient for cycle times in terms of feedback loops.
Yeah, I do hear you. I think that the better we can get at measuring health, the better. But, there's a reason why, even after all of these different ways of measuring mouse health or indeed human health, that have been developed over many decades, there is still no real consensus as to which ones are best. There's a reason for that. There's a biological reason for that. It's just like it's genuinely not a well-defined problem. And therefore, maybe the extra year or whatever it takes to get lifespan data just is worth it.
Absolutely. I mean, you need to develop the associations, right? Like you need to be taking frailty testing, spine curvature, total energy expend, rotor-rod test, all of those, and, time of death to be able to make that model, right? And then you can start to, run shorter feedback loops once you have the training data.
Yeah.
So excited by that for sure, but agree with you in the short term. We do need the lifespan experiments, but without it being open source and without all this data being, in a database that we can all access and build models off of, it will just be company after company running the same exercise over and over again. And there will never be institutional knowledge that's developed by our species over time, which to me is the biggest loss. And so in this effort to build value, we just keep creating and destroying value over and over again without very much to show for it.
Agree completely.
I'm just now noticing how much synergy there is between the two of you. I kind of want to zoom out and look at the longevity field as a whole, more specifically look at what the regulatory process would be for a potential longevity slash aging drug, right? So, I mean, Aubrey, we've talked about this before. The FDA doesn't define aging as a disease. And so we're kind of left looking at health related or diseases that are associated with aging, whether that's Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, all these different like kind of neurological diseases, rather than like going through the FDA pipeline with like an aging drug. Well, let's say that, that the FDA were to define aging as a disease, and there's these set endpoints that we have, like where we can go through the different trials. What would a clinical trial for a longevity drug actually look like? Like, when would you administer the drug? At what time point of a human's life? Like, what age group do you think is the best? Because for me, when I hear longevity and I think about it, I'm really thinking about the entire lifespan, right? Like, that trial could go on for decades if it works. And
Right.
so I'm curious about, go for it.
Yeah, there's a huge misconception here. The FDA is not the problem. And moreover, we already have the answer to your question. We have this thing called the TAME trial, which was described a decade ago now. The TAME trial was approved by the FDA. The FDA said, if you meet this clinical endpoint, then we will approve metformin for whatever word. I mean, maybe they wouldn't have used the word aging. They would say for broad-based chronic conditions of late life. Now, the endpoint, if you read it, was, repulsive. But it was repulsive for a very good reason. What they needed to do was define aging in a manner that the FDA could look at and say, right, this is binary. We will be able to say whether or not the clinical endpoint has been met. So how did they do that? They took a bunch of endpoints that were already individually perfectly uncontroversial, established endpoints for, success in Alzheimer's trial or an atherosclerosis trial or whatever. I think there were 5 of them. I forget now exactly. And they said, you just combine all these things. They had one additional brilliant feature, though, which was they were able to accommodate the crosstalk that exists between different types of age-related damage and pathology. Namely, what they said was, not only are we going to measure how long it takes before people in the trial come down with this or that condition, with any of these conditions, we're also going to measure the delay, the difference in time between the time when they come down with the first such condition and the time when they come down with a second one, and exhibiting multimorbidity. So that essentially captures everything you need to capture in aging, pretty much. I mean, even though the TAME trial has not happened, because it never got funded, and even though people are now, not at all sure that if it were funded, it should really be testing metformin, doesn't matter, because what has not been criticized or, updated or in any way, felt, abandoned is the definition of the endpoint. So any big pharma company or whatever that has a treatment that they think is going to affect aging, in other words, that they think is going to have broad-based benefits on a wide range of different, problems of late life, they can totally use that. They can just copy and paste that clinical endpoint out of the TAME trial and done. They don't have an FDA problem at all. If Novo Nordisk had wanted to do that with one of the GLP agonists, they could have totally just done that. They didn't. They didn't need to because they already had a market with obesity. But, it's there. It's done.
For the sake of it, I would love to take the other side of the argument. I definitely agree with parts of what you said, but would love to take the other side of that, only because I think the way that you evaluate regulation is by the practical outcomes of that regulation. And the practical outcomes of this determination by the FDA is that there have been no longevity studies that have been run, like clinical trials, right? So practically speaking, the TAME study never got funded. Why? Because it cost $70 million.
But that's not what. The reason it didn't get funded was because it would have cost $70 million for something that nobody was going to make any money out of, because it's been off patent since before I was born.
Right.
Now, the reason why there's been no other trials is also a completely different reason. It's not because the time trial's clinical endpoint was inadequate. It's because there are no drugs. There is nothing to test in this way. Of course, as I say, it would have been wonderful if Novo Nordisk had not had a single thing to treat, namely obesity. And if they, then they could have perfectly well done a clinical trial on aging in general using the 10 trials endpoint. But there just aren't drugs that are in this spot where the preclinical data or the early stage data shows general benefits, and therefore that's the right clinical endpoint to be using to maximize your profits. There just aren't the drugs.
There aren't the drugs because the regulation in the system doesn't pull them through, because there is no clear commercialization pathway, because there's no FDA process for them to practically get through, get on market, get paid. And so there are no drugs because nothing's being tested, there's no R&D into it. You must create a system that pulls through the assets, right? And unless some financial person, some CFO sitting in some company and says, if we do XYZ, we will get paid this amount, and this amount is higher than the risk reward adjusted cost, then we're not doing it. And so again, I really believe that the best way to evaluate the system is based on its outputs, and the outputs are non-existent, to your point. And I wouldn't say it's because of the lack of drugs. I would say it is because it is the lack of a systemic framework to commercialize longevity therapeutics. And that is a combination of the insurance companies and the FDA. So I would say it is neither one alone, but together in concert, it breaks down everything, and everything converges at diseases. I would love, if you don't mind, if I can share my screen really quickly. Jao Magalhaes has this meme, and I think this is the meme.
Yep, that's about right.
And this is it, simply put. And semaglutide will never be put through longevity medications because they don't have to, because they can go after profitable disease therapies where insurance companies will pay absurd amount for once the patient is sick, and then they can charge absurd amounts for it. So because there is no capitalistic incentive for life extension yet, the system that can generate life extending therapies, this whole system is broken.
I feel we simply can't answer this question right now because we don't know of any drugs that have actually, hit this wall that you're hypothesizing. What I'm saying is that we also can't answer the question, if the FDA tomorrow declared aging as a disease and rewrote the 10 clinical endpoint in a manner that was about 10% as long, would that change anything? I don't think it would change anything at all. I mean, so to the extent that the problem you're describing is true, which, as I say, I don't really agree, but supposing it is true, it would still be true then.
Well, the FDA's designation doesn't matter in this case. It's the insurance company, right? And so let the insurance companies declare aging a disease, right? And say we will pay X amount of dollars for a therapeutic that can extend life by Y years. Then that's when it matters. All of the money.
So that may now happen. I mean, we are certainly already seeing insurance companies like Kaiser, promoting preventative lifestyle and so on. You can affect your premium by how you behave before you get sick. Now, that could totally continue. It could totally be that Kaiser may vary your premium depending on whether you take semaglutide.
It's unfortunately illegal. And this came through with Obamacare. If you go look at the Obamacare statute, which I highly recommend, it's very, very sad. But one of the things that they slipped in is you cannot discriminate as an insurance company premiums based on, they call them pre-existing conditions. Well, it's any sort of behavior due to pre-existing conditions. What I mean is they are catering to the weakest link. Of course, if you are handicapped and in a wheelchair, you cannot go for a run. And so they do not allow insurance companies to reduce your premiums for going on a run or going on a bike and actually being healthy.
Right.
And the result of this is now you can no longer have incentives for people to be healthy.
Of course, you're completely right that the problem with the legality of taking account of pre-existing conditions is a big problem. However, we have to remember that only certain things are counted as pre-existing conditions. So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it is legal for Kaiser to determine someone's premium on the basis of their BMI, and in particular also on the basis of whether they are responding to their BMI by taking semaglutide. Is that illegal?
It is illegal. It's so unfortunate. If that were the case, oh my God, like you would see crazy improvements. I believe you would see crazy improvements in health and well-being and general health taking. But because you cannot do that, because you cannot create those incentives as an insurance company, they don't happen. It's illegal. And you have a populace that is basically like not incentivized to be healthy and expects the system to take care of them once they get sick. And then their costs become extreme and their health all of a sudden is like of importance to them. So this inherently is one of the biggest problems. We have a family friend who runs an insurance company based in the UK called Vitality, and Vitality is massive. And in the UK, you are allowed to run such schemes where you incentivize people to take over X number of steps and reduce their premiums and give them gift cards, et cetera, et cetera. But in the US, it is unfortunately illegal. My hope is that life insurance and health insurance kind of merge so that the insurance company is incentivized to keep you alive and paying premiums. And so people call it vitality insurance. And my hope is that entity, will be incentivized to keep you alive. And if they're incentivized to keep you alive, they will give you rewards in the short term for taking healthy actions in the short term that benefit their ROI in the long term. All of this breaks down because insurance companies only have 4-year ROI because it's tied to employment. The average employment time is 4 years. And so you have no incentive to have preventative care because in 4 years, you're somebody else's problem. And then once you're 65, you're Medicare's problem. So this whole system is engineered around getting people to 65 with spending as little as possible. That's how the incentives are structured. Anyway, it's completely broken. My genuine hope, frankly, just before I finish, is that crypto can solve these problems because the fiat system is broken. And in the same way that it was better to build Bitcoin than reform the Fed, it will be better to build a system with crypto rails that allows financing incentives and biotech R&D and insurance on the crypto side. It will be easier to do that than go and try reform the health insurance, the FDA, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, obviously I come from that far off place called the rest of the world. So I don't need any persuading that, the 4-year ROI issue is a huge problem. So, sure, it might be, that in this administration, we have the complete contempt for tradition sufficiently that such things could be overthrown and, the incentive structure could be changed such that, the ability to vary premiums on the basis of lifestyle or indeed medications became legal, at least up to a point. I wouldn't put it past them.
I certainly hope so. It's obviously extremely difficult to overturn legislation in the US. And, so most of the incentives, at least on the legislative side, are to add regulation versus remove. So I really hope you're right, but we can't bank on it. And so we have to kind of design with the mindset that it is not going to happen. But we can, of course, be optimistic and hope that, the work is for fraught, but I think we must design a system expecting the legislative efforts to fail.
Yeah, fair enough.
Aubrey, do you have a plausible mechanism by which we could change that, or
well,
is
so
it more
in the US specifically, one thing that we do have that is that counteracts to some extent the inertia that Benji was mentioning is the fact that it's the United States, and the states, are to some extent able to enact their own laws. Of course, within limits, but still. And so, 2 years ago, there was this extremely important advance that happened in Montana, where the federal right to try legislation that was put in place 6 or 8 years ago, I forget exactly when, was extended. Of course, other states have made mild extensions to the federal law, but this one was huge, because the federal law, and indeed every law in every other state as far as I know, restricts access to unapproved medicines, not only to, you've got to have it prescribed by a physician and you don't get reimbursed, but also you have to have tried everything that is approved for the condition you have, right? So it is by definition completely unavailable for anything preventative, because of course the point about preventative medicine is you don't have anything, right? Now, what happened in Montana was they said, so long as the thing you'd like to get access to has gone through phase 1, just phase 1, you can totally get it, even if you've never tried anything else and you don't have any conditions. Of course, again, you have to have it prescribed, but yeah. And so then they passed a second law earlier this year, which kind of gave more teeth and more incentive structure to the first law. But really, it was just like clarifications, as far as I can tell. And now there's a huge, push to get the same kind of things to happen in other states, especially bigger states. If it happens in Texas, we're rolling. Now, of course, it takes time for everything to shake down, even after legislation gets put in place. But this is the kind of thing that, could get the federal laws to be changed relatively rapidly. The only other way that I see that established jurisdictions such as the US are going to modernize their regulatory regimes is by FOMO. In other words, by seeing other places around the world doing things differently and doing them successfully. But unfortunately, that applies to all the other jurisdictions around the world as well. So the only real chance we have is these, special economic zones like this one in Honduras called Prospera, which is, doing its very best to become a global hub of medical tourism, focused to a very large extent on longevity, and that's all wonderful. But first of all, it's a tiny little place. How much FOMO is it really going to generate? And how soon is it going to do it? It's tricky. Plus also, it might even be closed down this year, depending on how the general elections go in Honduras in, I think, November. So, I have... And I'm an enormous supporter of both of those ways of going about the modernization effort. But if I had to choose one that I have greater optimism for, it would be the Montana approach.
Amazing. Yeah, I guess I believe that there are some special economic zones that are forming in Nevada, if I'm not mistaken, as well. I think that either Nevada has passed them or there's some sort of exemption you can get with a special economic zone in Nevada as well. But I'm 100% with you. I think the question becomes, is there a sufficient incentive if you can't get reimbursement for your medicine to run a phase 1 trial? Like, is there, and that becomes the question, right?
Okay, so I don't think this would significantly change the incentive to do the phase 1 trial. What it would do would allow a parallel income stream, to get money in the door, granted only for people who had their own money, but nevertheless a parallel income stream that would facilitate going through to phase 2 and phase 3. Of course, the majority of reasons why drugs don't go through to phase 2 is because the company runs out of money or can't raise the money for it, rather than because phase 1 failed.
Absolutely. No, I think that's wise. This was my hope with MiniCircle, frankly.
Right. Well, MiniCircle is still very much in business.
Yeah.
It did its early stage clinical trials. Well, it did its early stage clinical trials in Prospera, in this special economic zone in Honduras. It's based in Austin. It's very much looking at moving to other states, that may be more permissive for this kind of thing. So, MiniCircle is a great example of the kind of thing that we may see.
Yeah. I think that could be, I think you're 100% right, and that actually becomes the model. If you can start to make income after phase 1 from, this kind of like wealthier phenotype who can afford to pay for it out of pocket and, basically get it funded for that phase 2 and phase 3. But then comes the question of like, okay, once you get it past phase 3 and FDA approved, what for? And will the insurance company pay for it? Or will we just get, through phase 1 and then will it be like, okay, screw it with the insurance companies and the FDA? And we just like, okay, it's safe. Who knows if it's effective? We'll get real world data to find out if it's effective. But
yeah, I mean, what I don't know is the likelihood or indeed the legality of an insurance company just changing its business model and choosing to reimburse things like the ones we're talking
you would
about.
have to decouple insurance from employment, which is hard in the US, which is extremely hard because everyone shows up there.
Actually, would you?
Yeah, because otherwise you have no incentive, you have no financial incentive to do preventative medicine, longevity medicine. This is why it doesn't happen right now. This is why United Healthcare doesn't, pay a lot of money for preventative medicine, right? Because if you think about it, let's say I get a job, I sign up with United Health Plan. In 4 years, I move to a different company and I get a new health insurance plan. If they've invested any money into preventing any sort of chronic diseases that I have or could get, and they don't see the reward from having spent that, and now I go to a different insurance company, they have reduced the cost for their competitors, and now their competitors have to pay less, and so they're actually aiding their competition.
Totally. So they've reduced that. They have gained in the sense of if they stopped you from getting some chronic condition, some expensive condition during those 4 years, but not if they delayed it from 5 years to 10
Exactly.
years. Right. That's the problem you're describing. And so, yeah, I mean, I could totally see, a system in which that's just not allowed, in which basically, let's say you switch jobs, then the company that is covering your health insurance in your new job has to actually pay something to the company from the previous job, by way of balancing out exactly what you said.
I think it's tough. I think a much cleaner way to do it is to decouple it from employment completely.
If we could. And, welcome to England. But
yeah. NHS, baby. I wouldn't say like the NHS is the exact model, the exemplary model either. So I think something like privatized health insurance decoupled from employment is likely closer to the optimal. And what you see with life insurance companies, just as kind of like validation data, is they do have some of these incentives to not smoke, take, get regular blood draws, et cetera, et cetera. They are starting actually to do the preventative healthcare work on the life insurance side. And it's because they don't have these same regulations that are in place. And so to me, that is really strong validation data that if you removed that regulation and kind of combined life insurance and health insurance into this kind of decoupled vitality insurance from employment, that it would actually, there would be an economic incentive to keep people healthy.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Anyway, we'll get off this horse.
Well, we're past the time that we've allotted for the interview, so either of you have to go, feel free to.
I probably do have to go pretty soon.
Okay, sounds good. I think this will be like a good closing finish to everything. Thank you guys so much for coming on. I honestly learned so much from just the two of you talking. I was just sitting here and, like that makes a lot of sense. I haven't thought about insurance in that way at all, to be honest. So
yeah, no, this was an absolute pleasure. I think that, a lot of people in the longevity space focus on the scientific problems. And for me, like there are brilliant minds like Aubrey's that are in the longevity space. And I think it's much more important rather than focusing on, which modality is going to be, the winning bullet. How do we liberate these innovators to, basically run as fast as they possibly can and come up with and, generate the data that's needed to, achieve longevity escape velocity. And many of the times, like what I come back to is that it's not the actual science that's rate limiting. It really is these other layers, the systemic layers, the funding layers. So this is less about like insurance and FDA and like, and financing. It's about how do we remove all other rate limiters so that everything bottoms out at the quality of the ideas of the researchers that are already in the space, right? And so to me, like that's where this whole kind of DeSci world actually becomes super interesting, is because you can really liberate all the participants in the space to move much quicker towards solutions. And yeah, I think that many people in the longevity, I would say like maybe broadly in the scientific and biotech space, see DeSci as kind of like a crypto scam. But in reality, I really believe that many of the solutions to the problems that all the people in the traditional biotech and healthcare space know about reside in DeSci, because you can build from the ground up, and you have to build with capitalistic first principles. And to me, many of the ideas we're talking about here are engineering problems that the old system is probably too ingrained to ever solve, and that we kind of have to rebuild from the foundation. And I would hope that many of the people listening who are more scientific see us as more than like a crypto scam, but rather is trying to, engineer incentives around achieving longevity escape velocity.